This week, the most powerful senators in the United States Senate. The people who will decide whether the Clarity Act lives or dies. Who controls the future of American crypto regulation? Who determines which digital assets get protected under federal law? Sat down for a private meeting. And at that table, representing the entire digital asset industry, was one person. Not two, not a coalition, not a rotating panel of crypto CEOs. One. Brad Garlinghouse. The head of Solana was not in that room. The head of Ethereum was not in that room. The leaders of every other major digital asset project that has been lobbying for regulatory clarity for years, they were not at that table. Now ask yourself the question that should be making you deeply uncomfortable right now, or deeply confident, depending on which side of this trade you're on. When the senators in that room write the final language of the Clarity Act, whose interests will they have heard most clearly? Whose asset will they have been thinking about? The empty chairs just told you everything. Welcome back to XRP News Flow Signals, where we read the meeting, not just the press release. This is not financial advice. Always do your own research. But if you want to understand why the empty chairs at a Senate meeting this week are the most structurally significant development in XRP's regulatory history, stay with me. This one connects fast. Let's start with the hard truth that the delay narrative keeps burying. In complex multi-stakeholder legislation, the organizations whose leaders are physically present in the room when compromise language is being finalized are the organizations whose interests get written into that language. This is not a theory about politics. It's how every major piece of financial regulation in American history has been shaped. The entities in the negotiating room shape the outcome. The entities outside it find out what was decided after the fact. This week, Brad Garlinghouse was in the room. Here is the precise list of who he met, individually, not in a group briefing, but one-on-one. Senator Bill Hagerty, a key architect of the digital asset framework language currently being debated. Senator Bernie Moreno, whose vote is critical for getting the bill out of committee. Senator Tim Scott, the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, the single most powerful individual in the Clarity Act's path to the Senate floor. Senator John Boozman, a committee member whose alignment is required for the bill to move. Patrick Whitmore, the White House Special Advisor on Crypto, the person whose internal read on the process has consistently been the most accurate signal of where things actually stand, not publicly, but inside the administration. That is the decision-making core of the entire Clarity Act process, assembled around one person. And after those meetings, Garlinghouse walked out and said publicly at the Semaphore World Economic Summit, one of the most prestigious financial policy conferences in the United States, the following: "After a day of conversations with these leaders, I know we are closer than ever. Not hopeful, not optimistic. I know." That word choice is not accidental. Hope and optimism are emotional states. Knowing is an epistemic claim. It means he has information that produced a conclusion. He walked into those meetings with open questions. He walked out with answers that increased his conviction. The Solana CEO did not get those answers this week. The Ethereum CEO did not get those answers this week. Brad Garlinghouse did. And the legislative language being written in those meetings will reflect the conversations that happened in them, not the conversations that didn't. Now let's run the timeline numbers that the delay narrative keeps misrepresenting, because the math of the legislative window is not as tight as the social media panic suggests. The Senate Banking Committee markup on the Clarity Act slipped from the final week of April into the first or second week of May. That slip triggered the familiar wave of anxiety. Every postponement read as a step toward the bill dying entirely. Here is the structural counterargument from inside the process. Paradigm's VP of Regulatory Affairs, one of the most informed observers of the actual legislative mechanics, not the social media commentary about them, stated publicly, "The real time crunch does not begin until after Memorial Day. Do the math. That means senators currently have 6 to 7 weeks to move the Clarity Act out of the Senate Banking Committee and onto the Senate floor. and the broader legislative window before midterm election dynamics begin consuming all available congressional attention extends approximately 12 to 13 weeks from now. Now connect that to what Senator Tim Scott said publicly about the specific issues remaining. He identified 3, and he put timelines on each. Issue 1, stablecoin yield rewards. Scott expressed confidence this resolves within 2 weeks. Issue 2, DeFi provisions. He described this as nearly as close to resolution as the rewards issue. Another 2 weeks. Issue 3, full Republican Senate alignment. Another 2 weeks. His conclusion, delivered publicly: as we headed to summer, the Clarity Act issue will be resolved and Congress will be moving on to other things. That is not the language of a chairman managing a crisis. It is the language of a chairman managing a calendar. And then, Senator Thom Tillis announced he is preparing to release the draft compromise text on the stablecoin yield issue, the primary contentious provision that has held the entire bill hostage. This is a critical procedural signal that most coverage completely missed. When the compromise language on the central contested issue gets released publicly as draft text, the negotiation phase ends and the voting phase begins. Those are 2 fundamentally different stages of the legislative process. Draft text means the language has been agreed to in private. Publication is the formality that moves the process to votes. The bill is not stalling. It is transitioning from negotiation to voting on a timeline that Senator Scott has now mapped publicly with specific issue-by-issue resolution windows. 6 to 7 weeks. 3 issues. 2 weeks each. Now, let's talk about the 2 institutional signals this week that received far less coverage than they deserved. Because together, they change the picture of what the post-Clarity Act world looks like at the monetary policy level. Signal 1, Kevin Warsh. The nominee to replace Jerome Powell as Federal Reserve Chair just filed his financial disclosure. The document reveals over $100 million in assets. And embedded within that disclosure is a detail that fundamentally repositions the future of U.S. monetary policy toward digital assets. Warsh holds investments in approximately a dozen crypto and blockchain companies through venture fund structures, a DeFi lending protocol, a decentralized exchange, Ethereum scaling networks, among the most substantial crypto-adjacent investment exposure ever disclosed by a Fed chair nominee. Think about the structural implication. The incoming head of the Federal Reserve, the person who will set U.S. monetary policy, shape how federally chartered banks are permitted to engage with financial innovation, and influence the regulatory posture of every U.S. banking regulator, is personally invested in the success of blockchain technology. He has already made the determination that this technology is legitimate. With his own money, before taking office, a Fed chair with personal crypto investments does not need to be convinced. He arrives with conviction already formed. Signal 2, Jamie Dimon. The CEO of JP Morgan, the largest bank in the United States, made positive public comments about digital assets this week. By the assessment of analysts who track his statements closely, this represents one of the first times he has done so publicly. In institutional finance, public positioning shifts from CEOs of Dimon's stature do not happen casually. They reflect conclusions that have already been reached in private. Sophisticated analysts read Dimon's positive shift as a specific signal. The Clarity Act compromise language has reached a point where JP Morgan's interests and the interests of the broader banking sector it represents have been sufficiently addressed. He is not reacting to the legislation passing. He is pre-positioning for a world where it already has. When the largest bank in America begins publicly shifting its posture toward digital assets, while the incoming Fed chair holds a dozen crypto investments, the question is no longer whether institutional adoption happens. It is what the world looks like the week it does. I want to stop here for a second, because mapping Garlinghouse's individual Senate meetings to the Tim Scott timeline, to the Warsh disclosure, to the Dimon positioning shift as a single coherent signal, rather than 4 unrelated news items, is exactly the kind of structural reading this channel exists to deliver. If you want this level of legislative and institutional mapping in your feed every week, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals right now and turn on notifications. Because what I am about to cover, what the Clarity Act actually unlocks for XRP when it passes, is the part most channels never reach. You want to be in the room for this. Let's be precise about what the Clarity Act actually changes for XP when it passes, because most coverage focuses on when, without mapping what. Unlock 1. U.S. Bank Integration. The primary reason U.S. banks have not deployed XRP at scale is not technical. The gray area around XRP's regulatory status creates compliance exposure that bank legal departments cannot approve. The Clarity Act eliminates that gray area with statutory language, not guidance, not a court ruling, but an act of Congress that requires a new act of Congress to change. When that happens, U.S. banks can integrate XRP into payment rails and cross-border infrastructure without legal risk. Unlock 2. Institutional capital deployment. Pension funds, registered investment advisors, and large asset managers whose compliance frameworks prohibit exposure to assets with unclear regulatory status. Those constraints are removed when XRP is classified as a commodity in federal statute. The capital weighting behind that legal gate is not measured in millions. It is measured in the kind of numbers that move markets structurally. Unlock 3. Expanded ETF landscape. With formal commodity classification, the pathway to spot XRP ETF products from BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, and other major asset managers becomes legally clear. The same pathway Bitcoin's classification created for spot Bitcoin ETFs. Unlock 4. U.S. framework as global template. When the world's largest financial market formally classifies XRP as a commodity, every jurisdiction treating U.S. regulatory frameworks as the standard follows. The global institutional adoption story accelerates, not just in America, but in every market that has been waiting for U.S. regulatory leadership. Here is the window that the legislative timeline defines. 6 to 7 weeks until the Memorial Day deadline. 3 issues with 2-week resolution windows each. Draft compromise text on the primary contested provision about to be released publicly. The negotiation phase ending. The voting phase beginning. Garlinghouse was in the room when the language was being shaped. Warsh arrives at the Fed, already invested in blockchain success. Dimon is pre-positioning before the bill has passed. The institutions are not waiting for the Clarity Act to make their decisions. They are making their decisions now, in the window between the language being finalized and the vote being cast. That window is open right now. It will not stay open. Let me leave you with the frame that ties everything together. There were empty chairs in that room this week. The head of Solana was not there. The head of Ethereum was not there. The leaders of every other major digital asset project lobbying for regulatory clarity, they were outside the building. Brad Garlinghouse was at the table with the Banking Committee chairman, the key architects of the Clarity Act language, and the White House crypto advisor. He walked out and said, "I know we are closer than ever." Kevin Warsh, the incoming Fed chair, holds investments in a dozen crypto and blockchain companies. Jamie Dimon, CEO of the largest U.S. bank, just made his first positive public comments about digital assets. Senator Tim Scott mapped 3 specific issues with 2-week resolution timelines each. The empty chairs were not an accident. They were the signal. And the price has not reflected what was decided in that room yet. If this reading of the legislative signal changed how you see this moment, subscribe to XRP News Flow Signals before the Memorial Day window closes. We map the meeting, the mechanics, and the money. Before the vote, not after. Drop 1 word below. Seat if the empty chair signal landed. Let's see who caught it. Stay sharp. The signal does not lie. Not financial advice. Always conduct your own research.